I've been doing Node for about 3 years professionally and 2 years unprofessionally before that. And in those 3 years of doing Node professionally, I came across a few common patterns that happen so often that I thought it was worth talking about them because some of those things are quite interesting in the problems. So what I wanted to do tonight was just talk about the war stories of using Node.js for 3 years at scale. So large teams with large amounts of requests, large amounts of data. I thought of a few alternative talk names for this talk on Node.js, error handling. A boring talk one. I thought this was a good Anyway, going to the pain. This talk isn't about doing things correctly, because that's what we always want to do. What this talk is about is when you do something wrong, what happens and how do you figure it out and how do you debug the problem? Because we all want to do it right, but inevitably with a large team we're going to do something that is so wrong that it's not even wrong, and it's going to be really hard to figure out what's happening. So what I'm going to talk about today is how to shoot yourself in the foot with Node.js, and you will do it. And there's 3 ways, there's 3 patterns that I've seen: leaking callbacks, leaking promises, and leaking sockets. And I'll be talking about all 3 of those. Promises is more recent because I haven't done too much promises before, but I have been working on it a bit recently. Firstly, I'm going to introduce a common thing you see in production code. And apologies if people can't read this. I'll try to describe this code as best I can. Most Node applications are built on Express or Restify, and you have a request handler. Usually they get something from a database, and to get things from a database, we tend to use something called resource pooling. So this is a very, very common pattern. Why do we use resource pooling, and what is resource pooling? When you connect to a database, it costs you to create a socket. It has the cost of doing a handshake with the database. You send your SQL, then you terminate the connection perhaps, and memory gets freed on the database, memory gets freed on your server, and everyone's happy. The problem with that is doing all of that is expensive. So in a typical application, you might have 30 milliseconds to create this connection. You do 5 milliseconds of processing. You might just get one user from the database with a really nice index. So 30 milliseconds connecting, 5 milliseconds getting your data. You could massively increase your throughput by keeping a connection open, and everyone who needs it just reuses that connection. So that's something we call resource pooling, or socket pooling, or connection pooling, or whatever. So in this example application, we're connecting to MySQL, we're creating a pool, and we're using that pool in our request handler. So I'm also here throwing an error. Now you shouldn't throw uncaught errors in Node, but it happens. Someone forgets something and then we get an error. Undefined is not an object or whatever it is. This happens. Express helps us here. It says, okay, we've got an error. We're going to present to the user something based on an error handle. We'll probably show them a stack trace. The server stays up. It's not good, but it happens. It's common. This is kind of okay. But what do you people think happens if the error is within this? Well, it's very simple. The whole thing crashes, the server goes down, Node closes the process, it terminates all of the connections for everyone who's using that Node server, and because Node is asynchronous and you might have 100 people making requests at the same time, they all get terminated and they get some sort of a weird error. If then the thing that's running your Node app tries to start it up again and someone sends a similar request and we get the same error, it'll just keep crashing, and then eventually someone's going to give up and you're not going to have a server. This I've seen many times. So this is a very common thing because we always have resource pooling, we always have request handling, and we always have this problem. Why does this happen? Why does express error handling not catch this? Let's look at the stack trace that we get. Well, we actually have a stack trace, which is quite remarkable in Node.js. The stack trace is linked to the socket. It seems to start at something about a socket. This is not our request handler. This is our DB connection pool. So the DB connection pool initializes these connections when the program starts. It has a callback which we attach to. So this thing thrown here actually is part of this stack trace, not this stack trace. Express doesn't get to do its nice uncaught exception handler. The DB connection pool does it, and we don't get our nice error handling. This is incredibly common. I thought this was a suitable. This is my only Star Wars slide for the day. This describes error handling with callbacks sometimes. Asynchronous programming is just hard. Many problems are asynchronous, but it's just really hard. If you can ever do your programming synchronously, it's probably a good thing. Node exists because we have lots of asynchronous problems, but it's hard. How can we get around this in this particular case? The only solution we have, well, I'll talk about other solutions later, but the only solution we kind of have these days is something called domains. Domains are deprecated. We're told not to use them, but we don't have an alternative. So we use a domain to stitch the error handling for this to this, and it's sort of a bit of magic, in this case from the Express domain middleware. And then if you have a team of 10 people who are working on the code that eventually gets called back in here, and that shells out to something, if one of them screws up, at least you still have a server. So at the moment, domains are the solution for this. But they're not considered a good solution, but we don't have any good alternatives at the moment. Next problem that I've often seen is promises. Now, this is a terrible use of promises, and I think I was doing this last week, or something similar. I was working on a code base that had this deeply embedded within it, and I couldn't figure out why I was getting an unrejected promise or something. So what do you people think happens here? Make a mental note. Look at this code. We have a promise 2. We have a promise 1. We're calling promise 1, and we're doing a dot then to then call promise 2. And we have a catch to catch any errors on these promises, because that's what you do with promises, and that's good. So this is going to run the first promise. Then it's going to run the second promise. The second promise is going to throw an exception, and it's going to get caught here, and everything is great. No, that's not what happens. The second promise runs, then the first promise runs, and then we get an unhandled promise rejection warning, which gives us no indication of where this problem happened. Imagine you have 30 files in your application. You've got lots of Node modules. You don't know where this is happening. You get really frustrated. You end up doing effectively a binary tree search of your code. You comment out code until this goes away, and then you figure out where it is. If we had a stack trace, that would be a 0-1 lookup. This is now what a n log n or something lookup. Yay! So yeah, it's kind of not very good. Thinking about what we're doing wrong here, the real problem here is that a promise, when you chain promises, you don't pass a promise to the then, you pass a function that returns a promise. But sometimes, due to subtle ways your code gets run or something, this doesn't happen and you get something like this. So when you need to find these issues, the easiest way is to put a process.unhandled rejection, and then you have a stack trace. Why Node doesn't do this by default, I'm not sure. I'm assuming there's a good reason. but that's sort of a bit of magic where when you have this, you don't need to randomly comment code until you find where your error is. You just put that in your code. Even better would be to have if this function was a function that returned a promise rather than just returning a promise directly, which will get called straight away. Okay, the third class of thing that I've seen, so that was callbacks, you often lose your errors. Promises, you often lose your errors. What about making requests? So about the most common pattern for Node is you have a Node service that connects to other things. It stitches together a bit of XML, a bit of JSON, it returns some JSON. So effectively, it's a proxy which is glue. So you tend to have a thing which calls other things, does things, and gives back something. So we have here we're using the request library to do this. We're making a request to this endpoint. And if there's an error, we log that there's an error. If there's a success, we do nothing. What we're going to do is we're going to set up two intervals here. We're going to make this request every 10 milliseconds. And then we're going to also set up something which just watches how long it's been and what the memory usage of the process is. So, over time, because we're spinning up lots of these, we're just accumulating memory usage. And this is a common pattern. We have a lot of requests coming in. We're making requests to other things. We know that the network is unreliable, and in this case we're making a request to something which doesn't exist. What happens? Well, we just start gathering up memory. Now, if you're making HTTP requests and you're not specifying your timeout in Node, you probably have a memory leak. Most HTTP requests in Node don't specify their timeout, so most Node applications effectively are a memory leak if the network is unreliable, and the network is unreliable. So always specify your timeout. If you're on an older version of Node, you probably have a very long timeout or maybe no timeout. If you're on a recent version of Node, it may correctly use the timeout that comes from Linux. So when I ran this test, it actually timed out after 3 minutes. If you have 100 requests a second, and in addition, the CDN or the reverse proxy will duplicate requests when it doesn't get a response, you're going to get a lot of requests which are going to be accumulating memory, and your server will crash.
What?
Yeah, so be aware of what's happening with timeouts with HTTP requests in Node or with any external request, whether that's a database request, any external things you're connecting to. If you don't know what the timeout behavior is, then probably something bad will happen and you just don't know about it until the network becomes unreliable. So why do we still use Node? It's terrible, right? No. Everything is terrible. Everything is amazing. When we're programming, 20% of the time, we're in this state. Everything is amazing. We're writing our code. We're using cool technologies. Everyone else is using Java or C#, and we're doing this amazing language that, it's cool. It's fun. I enjoy doing Node. I don't enjoy doing Java or C#. 20% of the time, we're in this mode. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm getting an unhandled promise rejection. I don't know where in my code it is. It's very frustrating. There is no language or environment in which this doesn't happen. If you're using Haskell, you have different frustration, but you do have frustration. And if you're connecting to external things with Haskell, well, you're going to have a bad time anyway. So, using Node, we're doing the hard things, not the business logic, but we're gluing things together. So we're always going to have our time split between these two things. It's okay. Having every single thing we choose is going to have frustrations. These are some of the common frustrations we have with Node. Java has different frustrations. Very, very quickly, I don't know how I'm doing for time. I'm probably okay. Other things which I didn't want to go into detail where I've had pain. When you do logging in Node, it's often the most expensive thing your application is doing. If you have clever logging code or middleware or something, you will often find that it gets into an endless loop from circular references. If you're logging verbosely, it's probably like more than 90% of your CPU time is in the logger and the serializer of the logger. That leads me to the next thing. If you're doing anything with your node service and you're serving people on the web, probably you're going to have a CPU-locked event loop and you're going to have a bad time. If you have any heavy JSON documents, try to parse those somehow offline. Don't try and do it on the customer request unless you know you don't have a problem of scale. And many people don't have problems of scale, but some people do, and we can make a problem of scale very easily. NPM auto upgrade, this is one that's bitten me probably every 6 months or so. If you don't lock down your dependencies in NPM, they auto upgrade and you get a broken build, and you didn't do anything to make that happen. That's merely because someone thought a minor update wouldn't break anything, and it did. Over time, we start with 50 dependencies. We don't add any, but our dependencies add dependencies. It feels like we have an exponential growth in node modules over time, and that makes this problem worse. CoffeeScript, just no, don't do it. Don't do CoffeeScript. Yeah, so I still really enjoy doing Node, and I hope this wasn't sort of Node is terrible, don't use it. It's merely these are some of the things that I got frustrated with, but compared to the more businessy sides of software delivery, it's still really fun. Thanks. Questions?
Wondering, just like, because I know Node introduced async await, and you can use them instead of callbacks or promises. Does that solve any of the issues?
Yes, I didn't mention it, and I intended to, but async await's pretty amazing. I haven't used it enough to have been bitten by it, but so far it seems like the promised land. More questions?
Hi, so I write Haskell for a day job, so just
Whoa.
so no. All my day job on the right-hand side. I have no idea what I'm doing. Seriously though, NPM auto upgrade. Have you actually looked at something like shrink wrap or the new NPM 5 locking stuff or the yarn style locking to try and stop the
Yeah, so
locking particular version?
just for the recording, you're using Haskell and you still have no idea what you're doing every day, which is very comforting because I think of Haskell as being the super geniuses of the programming world. The Haskell users, I should say. In terms of shrink wrap and yarn, I'm using yarn at the moment. It seems to solve everything and makes everything faster, and I'm sure nothing will ever go wrong.